I need you to halt everything you are currently doing and clear your mind of any distractions, because the gravity of the situation I am about to describe demands your absolute, undivided attention. We are witnessing the total collapse of the foundational assumptions that have underpinned the relationship between the United States and its closest ally for over a century. This is not some minor diplomatic spat over steel tariffs, nor is it a typical breakdown in high-level trade negotiations that can be smoothed over with a press release. What we are discussing is an act of unprecedented financial volatility, a tectonic shift in geopolitics that has effectively shattered the special relationship in a single stroke. While the vast majority of the American public was sleeping soundly in the silent dark hours of a Saturday morning, the most devastating financial weapon in the United States arsenal was quietly unholstered and deployed against a nation that has stood shoulder to shoulder with us through every major global conflict since the dawn of the 20th century. By the time the sun rose, the shockwaves had already begun to ripple through the global financial system, leaving the world's markets reeling and uncertain of what remains of the international order. At precisely 3:17 a.m., under the cover of a weekend lull, the United States Treasury Department issued a directive that can only be described as a nuclear option for the banking sector. This order was transmitted directly to the executive suites of the undisputed titans of Wall Street, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo. The language of the mandate was chillingly clinical and terrifyingly simple. These institutions were ordered to terminate all correspondent banking relationships with every Canadian financial institution within a 72-hour window. This isn't a timeline measured in weeks or even business days. It is a 72-hour countdown that ignores the complexities of global commerce and the trillions of dollars in interconnected assets. As you read these words, that clock is ticking down, minute by agonizing minute, bringing us closer to a total economic decoupling. This is not a theory, a rumor from a disgruntled staffer, or mere political speculation. This is a documented, signed, and legally binding official mandate. It is currently sitting on the desks of the most powerful bankers on the planet, who are now scrambling in a state of sheer panic to figure out how to dismantle a century of financial integration without triggering a global depression. The implications of this directive are so vast that they threaten to dismantle the very architecture of the global economy as we know it. Correspondent banking is the invisible plumbing of the world. It is the essential mechanism that allows money to move across borders, enabling a business in Toronto to pay a supplier in New York, or a citizen in Vancouver to use a credit card abroad. By severing these ties, the US has effectively placed Canada behind a financial iron curtain, treating an ally like a rogue state. This move bypasses traditional diplomacy and goes straight for the jugular of the Canadian economy, creating a vacuum that will inevitably be filled by chaos or by America's strategic rivals. We are no longer talking about a policy disagreement. We are talking about a deliberate, calculated effort to paralyze the financial lifeblood of a sovereign G7 partner. If this order is allowed to reach its 72-hour conclusion, the world as we understood it on Friday will cease to exist by Tuesday morning, leaving a trail of broken trust and economic ruin that may take generations to repair. To truly grasp the magnitude of why this directive is a catastrophic event, one must peer beneath the surface of the global economy and understand the intricate, often invisible network known as correspondent banking. This is not merely a piece of dry financial jargon relegated to the footnotes of academic textbooks. It is the literal plumbing of the modern world. Just as a city relies on a hidden network of pipes to deliver water and remove waste, the global economy relies on correspondent banking as the essential infrastructure that allows international commerce to even exist. Without it, the flow of capital ceases, and the machinery of global trade grinds to a violent absolute halt. To dismantle these relationships is not to simply turn off a valve, it is to rip the very pipes out of the foundation of a sovereign nation's economy. The reality is that nearly every significant global transaction involving the United States dollar, which remains the overwhelming reserve currency for the vast majority of all international trade, must pass through these specific, highly regulated relationships. This system creates a central bottleneck that the US Treasury controls with absolute authority. When a Canadian manufacturing giant needs to pay a parts supplier in Germany, that payment does not travel directly from Toronto to Berlin in a straight line. Instead, those funds must move through a US correspondent bank, clearing through the financial hubs of New York City before they can be converted or settled in Europe. The same holds true for the macroeconomic stabilizers of the nation. when a Canadian pension fund responsible for the retirements of millions of citizens seeks to diversify its portfolio by purchasing assets in Japan, those billions of dollars must first clear through the American financial nervous system. The reach of this plumbing extends all the way down to the individual level, affecting the mundane daily lives of ordinary people in ways they never realize until the system fails. If a Canadian citizen is on vacation in Mexico and swipes their credit card to pay for a meal, that simple, instantaneous transaction is only possible because of a complex web of back-end authorizations that ultimately touch US financial servers. By abruptly cutting off these ties, the United States isn't just making international trade more expensive or cumbersome, it is making it physically and legally impossible. You aren't just putting pressure on a government, you are effectively transforming a stable G7 currency into worthless localized paper overnight. You don't just sanction an economy with a weapon of this caliber, you strangle it, cutting off its oxygen until every business, from the smallest local shop to the largest multinational corporation, is left gasping for survival in a marketplace where they can no longer buy, sell, or settle a single debt beyond their own borders. The historical gravity and sheer audacity of this decision cannot be overstated, as it represents a radical departure from over a century of established geopolitical norms. To understand the magnitude of what has just occurred, one must look at the exclusive and infamous company Canada has just been forced into. This specific financial weapon, the total severance of correspondent banking, is not a standard tool of diplomacy, it is an instrument of ultimate economic warfare, a financial death penalty that has been reserved for the world's most dangerous actors. In modern history, this lever has been pulled exactly 3 times. The first was in 2012 against Iran, a move designed to cripple a regime aggressively pursuing nuclear weapons and funding global instability. The second was in 2017 against North Korea, a brutal, isolated autocracy that routinely threatens its neighbors and the American mainland with nuclear annihilation. The third was in 2022 against Russia, following Vladimir Putin's unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent documentation of widespread war crimes. These were rogue states, international pariahs, and regimes that the entire Western world agreed had forfeited their right to participate in the global community. Now, in an act that defies every strategic and historical logic, there is a fourth name on that dark list, Canada. This is not a hostile dictatorship or a state sponsor of terror. This is the country that shares the longest undefended peaceful border in human history with the United States. This is the nation whose soldiers fought and bled in the surf of Normandy alongside American GIs to liberate Europe, and whose pilots have patrolled the skies in joint command for decades. This is the neighbor that without hesitation opened its airports, its community centers, and its private homes to thousands of terrified and stranded Americans when the towers fell on September 11th, and every flight in American airspace was grounded. Canada has been the brother in arms, the premier trading partner, and the most reliable pillar of the North American security perimeter. By applying the same nuclear financial measures to Ottawa that were designed for Tehran and Pyongyang, the United States has effectively reclassified its closest friend as an existential enemy, treating a stable G7 democracy, a nation woven into the very fabric of American life like a rogue regime in a 3:17 a.m. directive, is a decision of such staggering consequence that it will reverberate through international relations for generations. It signals to every other American ally, from London to Tokyo, that no amount of shared history, no degree of economic integration, and no level of sacrifice is enough to protect a nation from being liquidated by a single signature in Washington. The list of 4 is no longer a collection of international outcasts. It is now a testament to the fact that in the current landscape, the line between an indispensable ally and a financial target has been completely erased. The catalyst for this unprecedented escalation reveals a deeply fractured and dangerously emotional decision-making process within the halls of power in Washington. The spark was ignited by Canada's recent sovereignty coalition announcements, a bold set of policies aimed at decoupling its economy from over-reliance on the US, coupled with a massive $500 billion defense procurement pivot that sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. By choosing to build its own domestic defense industry and entertaining partnerships with European and Asian firms like Sweden's Saab for the Gripen fighter jet over the American F-35, Ottawa signaled that its days of quiet dependence were over. In response, the White House didn't engage in high-level diplomacy. Instead, it entered a state of controlled panic, Sources close to the administration describe a president who retreated from the Oval Office to his private quarters, spending hours paced in front of 3 different news monitors, watching the Canadian dollar and global markets react not with a strategic mind, but from a place of wounded pride. This was not a leader weighing the geopolitical consequences of a trade war. It was an emotional reaction to an ally daring to assert its own independence. As the sun began to set yesterday afternoon, at approximately 2 p.m., a desperate and unconventional back-channel message was dispatched to Ottawa. Rather than using the official channels of the State Department or the American ambassador, both of whom were reportedly bypassed to avoid leaving diplomatic fingerprints, the message was delivered through a private intermediary. The White House offered a de-escalation framework, but the terms were nothing short of a demand for total surrender. The president indicated he would be willing to discuss rescinding the 72-hour directive if, and only if, the Canadian government would stand before the world and publicly characterize the entire crisis, including the freezing of their sovereign assets and the threat of economic strangulation, as nothing more than a simple misunderstanding or a technical mix-up between friends. It was an invitation to national humiliation, a demand that a G7 partner participate in its own debasement to soothe a bruised ego in Washington. The response from Ottawa was not just a rejection, it was a historic moment of defiance that arrived with a speed that left the White House reeling. In the world of international diplomacy, where responses of this magnitude are usually drafted, debated, and refined over days by teams of lawyers and advisors, Canada's reply arrived in exactly 11 minutes. In the language of statecraft, an 11-minute turnaround is a thunderclap. It is a message delivered with the volume of a shout. The response was a single devastating sentence that will likely be studied in history books for decades. Canada does not negotiate under coercion. We will see the president at the appropriate international forum. There was no room for interpretation and no diplomatic ambiguity to hide behind. By the time that message was read, the bridge was not just burned, it was gone. This 11-minute silence, followed by a sharp, unequivocal refusal to be intimidated, is the direct reason why the Nuclear Treasury Directive was finalized and why the world woke up to a financial system on the brink of collapse. The moment that single defiant sentence from Ottawa was relayed to the White House, the fragile veneer of diplomatic process completely evaporated, replaced by a raw, unchecked exercise of executive pique. According to 3 separate high-level sources within the West Wing, the president did not call for a briefing, nor did he summon the Secretary of State or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to weigh the geopolitical ramifications of a total rupture. Instead, upon reading Canada's refusal to be humiliated, he reportedly uttered just 5 words that effectively declared a state of total financial war, cut them off from everything. In those 5 words, the deliberate machinery of American financial warfare, a system designed over decades to isolate terrorists and war criminals, was mobilized against a peaceful, democratic neighbor of 40 million people. There was no National Security Council meeting to debate the merits of the move, no emergency session with the Council of Economic Advisers to project the catastrophic blowback for American workers in the Great Lakes region or the Pacific Northwest, and not a single legal review to determine if such an order even fell within the constitutional boundaries of executive authority. It was a pure reflex of ego, a scorched earth response to a perceived personal slight that overrode every standing treaty and strategic interest of the United States. As the evening progressed and the Treasury Department began the grim work of drafting the formal directive between 6 p.m. and midnight, the atmosphere inside the building shifted from professional diligence to profound existential alarm. By 1 a.m., the internal tension reached a breaking point when a senior Treasury official, a career civil servant who had served with distinction under 4 different presidential administrations and helped navigate the 2008 financial crisis, made the harrowing decision to commit what amounts to professional suicide. Recognizing that the private internal warnings were being ignored, this official bypassed every protocol and leaked the full text of the directive to a major international news organization. Accompanying the document was a personal statement that served as a desperate distress flare to the American Republic and the global community. The official wrote with chilling clarity, "I have served in the Treasury Department under 4 presidents. I have never seen a directive this reckless. This will cause irreparable damage to the credibility of the U.S. financial system. I am providing this document because the American people deserve to know what is being done in their name." This act of whistleblowing was not a partisan stunt. It was the final desperate act of a patriot who realized that the guardrails of democracy had failed, when the very experts who are tasked with maintaining the stability of the US dollar and the integrity of the global banking system begin pulling the fire alarms in the middle of the night. It is a signal that the fire is no longer a localized flare-up. It is an all-consuming conflagration that threatens the entire structure. The leak confirmed the worst fears of the international community, that the most powerful financial engine in human history was no longer being steered by a steady hand of policy and precedent, but was instead being used as a bludgeon by a leader whose personal pride had eclipsed the national interest. By the time the Asian markets flickered to life just hours later, the world wasn't just reacting to a policy shift. It was reacting to the realization that the lender of last resort and the guarantor of global stability had become the primary source of global chaos. The fallout from the 3:17 a.m. directive was not a slow burn, it was an instantaneous global market incineration. As the sun followed the time zones across the globe, the shockwaves decimated the balance sheets of the world's most powerful financial institutions. In the pre-market hours, the carnage was staggering. JP Morgan shares plummeted 7%, Goldman Sachs dropped 8%, and Bank of America, the very backbone of American retail and commercial lending, suffered a brutal 11% loss in value. This violent sell-off was not merely a reaction to geopolitical instability, it was a cold, hard calculation of the immediate revenue suicide the United States had just committed. Wall Street analysts quickly estimated that this directive, by severing the ties that bind the two largest trading partners on Earth, would rip approximately $14 billion in high-margin annual revenue directly out of the American banking sector. This is the toll booth revenue, the trillions of dollars in annual transaction volume, from corporate payrolls to massive energy settlements that generate reliable, multi-billion-dollar fees for US banks every single year. By cutting off Canada, the president didn't just hurt our neighbor, he effectively burned down the most profitable wing of his own country's financial house. However, the plummeting stock prices are only the surface of a much deeper and more permanent crisis, the total evaporation of international trust. The undisputed global dominance of the US dollar has never rested solely on military might. It has rested on the world's collective belief that the American financial system is a neutral, professional, and apolitical utility. It is the global common of commerce. The moment that system is weaponized against a G7 ally over what the world perceives as a personal grudge or a wounded pride reflex, that fundamental trust is extinguished. Every central bank, sovereign wealth fund, and multinational corporation on the planet is now forced to confront a terrifying new reality. If it can happen to Canada, the most loyal partner in the American century, it can happen to anyone. This realization has transformed the backup plan into an existential necessity. Reports are already surfacing that the European Central Bank has called an emergency session to fast-track an independent euro-based clearing system that operates entirely outside of US jurisdiction, moving a project that was slated for the next decade into the next few months. While Washington reels from the market blowback, the response from Ottawa has been one of grim, decisive survival. In the middle of the night, while the financial world was still processing the directive, the Canadian Parliament convened an emergency session to pass the Financial Sovereignty Act. This landmark legislation is designed to do the unthinkable. It authorizes the Bank of Canada to bypass the US dollar entirely by establishing direct currency settlement agreements with any willing central bank, including immediate, high-level outreach to the People's Bank of China. Canada is building the infrastructure for a post-dollar world. This isn't just a temporary workaround, it is the creation of a permanent alternative financial highway. Once those pipes are laid, and once Canada proves that a major Western economy can function without the New York clearing system, the US dollar's exorbitant privilege will be gone forever. The plumbing of the world is being rerouted in real time, and as the 72-hour clock continues to tick, the United States is watching its most powerful tool of influence dissolve into a relic of a trust that no longer exists. As we stand at this precipice, the digital numbers on the global financial countdown have blurred into a grim reality. Only 66 hours remain before the world as we know it fundamentally changes. This is no longer a theoretical exercise in high-stakes brinkmanship. It is a live-wire crisis with a hard deadline that is currently being tracked in every trading floor from Hong Kong to London. If this directive is not rescinded before that clock hits zero, the legal, regulatory, and compliance frameworks that have been meticulously constructed over the last 3 decades will not just be paused, they will be systematically dismantled. People often fail to realize that the special relationship between the world's two largest trading partners isn't just a handshake, it is a complex web of millions of lines of code, thousands of bilateral treaties, and deep-seated institutional trust. You cannot simply reboot a system this interconnected. Once those correspondent banking relationships are formally terminated, the legal hurdles required to re-establish them will take years of painstaking negotiation, leaving a crater in the North American economy that may never be filled. We are currently witnessing the final hours of an era, standing at a historical crossroads where every path leads to a radical transformation of the global order. On one side, if the White House chooses to back down and rescind the order, it may save the immediate economy from a total freefall, but it will do so at a devastating cost to American prestige. It would signal to every adversary and ally alike that the most powerful financial weapons in the American arsenal are now subject to the whims of emotional volatility and can be retracted just as quickly as they were deployed, rendering US threats effectively empty. On the other side of this crossroads lies the path of no return. If the clock is allowed to run out, we will be forced to witness the intentional, state-sponsored destruction of the most successful and integrated economic alliance in the Western Hemisphere. We are watching the potential deglobalization of North America, a process that will freeze supply chains, liquidate businesses, and leave millions of citizens on both sides of the border in financial limbo. When the history of this decade is written, the central question will not be about trade balances or defense spending. It will be an investigation into how the world's most stable partnership spiraled into madness in less than 72 hours. Future generations will look at the list of four and struggle to comprehend how Canada, a peaceful, democratic neighbor, and the nation that stood as America's most loyal confidant, was grouped alongside the likes of Iran, North Korea, and Russia. They will ask how a relationship defined by shared sacrifice at Normandy and shared grief on 9/11 could be discarded in a 3:17 a.m. fit of pique. The tragedy of this moment is that while the machinery of financial warfare is efficient and fast, the machinery of human trust is fragile and slow. As the seconds tick away, the real question remains: is there anyone left in the halls of Washington with the courage, the foresight, and the political will to step forward and stop the clock before the damage becomes permanent?